Garages and parking spaces versus self-storage and storage units. Both are popular forms of real estate investing in Spain, but which one is better than the other? Let's find out. If you're new here, my name is Jonny. I'm originally from the UK, but I've been living and working in Spain for the past 4.5 years. I talk a lot of different topics about Spain on this channel, and one of them that I've talked about has been my self-storage investments that I've made in Spain. I own 2 storage units that I have in Madrid that I've been collecting rental income from. You can check out my videos where I talk about them in more detail. And I've also looked at purchasing and investing in parking spaces with the idea of then renting them out as well, but decided against it and decided to opt for storage units in the end. So in this video, I'm basically going to give you a comparative analysis between the two. What are the pros and cons of each? What is the expected return on investment? And is there one that's right for you? So let's start by looking at what is a storage unit and what is a parking space. Well, a storage unit typically is a small room, or it can even be a box, it depends on how big it is, but essentially a space where you have a door that you open up and you can store personal items in there. It might be, if you've got too much stuff for your house, for example, it might be equipment that's too big for the house, like golf clubs or a bicycle, for example. It may even be work equipment that you use your storage unit for keeping that kind of stuff there. And so typical places that you'll find storage units in Spain are either on like a dedicated floor or number of floors within an apartment complex, because there are a lot of new build apartments being built that have storage units kind of on a lower ground or a mezzanine floor, where owners of the property, they might have a storage unit linked to their apartment and then they can store their stuff in there. And at the same time, some of these storage units are on sale for the public, not necessarily for the people who are living in the same block. You can also find them like in kind of factory warehouse settings, or old garages even sometimes have been converted into storage unit spaces. So these are the most kind of common storage unit facilities that I've seen while I've been here. Now, parking space, I'm sure we're all familiar with. Basically, it's an allotted space within a parking garage where someone can park their car. Now, they come in different shapes and sizes. Some in Spain are like diagonal parking spaces, some are bay parking spaces, some are for motorbikes, some are for small cars, some are for large cars. What you'll typically find is that dimensions for a parking space in Spain tend to be about 2.5 meters by 4.5 meters. So that would be probably for like the average car size. Again, like a motorbike space would be much smaller than that, and you might find spaces that are bigger or smaller accordingly. And these spaces will typically be within a private parking garage as well. So why are these two forms of investment so popular? Well, I've talked a little bit about storage units in a past video, but to kind of sum it up, rents are increasing in city centers, and at the same time, people are accumulating more stuff with smaller living spaces, and not everyone has space in their home, in their apartment, to be able to store things. And as a result, there's kind of been a self-storage boom over the past couple of years, with facilities opening up, with new storage units becoming available, being built. And now this is kind of a solution, a low-cost solution for people who maybe can't store everything within their house, but do have things and they need to store them somewhere. This can be an economical, affordable solution for them to do it. Spain in particular is actually one of the top countries in Europe when it comes to self-storage demand. It accounts for about 10.5% of the total self-storage supply, behind France, which is about 11%, and the UK, which is miles ahead of everyone at about 39% of the total supply. So all that to say that self-storage basically is becoming more and more high demand. At the same time, parking spaces are also becoming more and more high demand. Cars have been around for a long time and a lot of people have had cars. A lot of new legislation that's coming in is kind of promoting less car usage and fewer of certain types of car in certain parts of the city, like ultra low emissions zones and all this kind of stuff. And as a result, with a lot of cars that don't necessarily meet the requirements to be able to park outside in the street or to drive in certain parts of the city, then there's people that need spaces to keep their cars, to park their cars when they're not in use. And specifically in Spain, if we take the example of Madrid, there's like an ultra low emission zone in the center of the city, and your car needs to have a certain emission sticker to be able to go in there. So you need a minimum of a B emission sticker to be able to drive through the center of Madrid. But if your car emission sticker is only B or C, then that means that you can't park in the street. You essentially need to find a public or private parking space to keep your car when you're not using it. And so as a result, then there's a lot of people whose cars have those emission stickers and are going to need somewhere to park them. So you can see high demand for both storage units and for parking spaces. Now we're going to get into kind of the nuances of each of them so you can understand the pros and cons of being an investor in self-storage and being an investor in parking spaces. As I say, keep in mind, I'm a self-storage investor, so I have a lot more knowledge, a lot more understanding of self-storage than I have of parking spaces. That said, I've done a good amount of research and I think I still have a good enough understanding of parking spaces to be able to make this comparison. So starting with self-storage, the initial investment is not typically very high. You can get a self-storage unit for 10,000 euros, give or take, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on the neighborhood, the area, what kind of facility you're looking at, what the size of the unit is, etc., etc. And so if you're an investor wanting to get started in property, in real estate, and the prices of self-storage are not prohibitive, you don't need a large amount of capital to get started. And so you're either going to be paying for it all with cash, in which case you've got no debt to worry about, but you could possibly finance it with debt. Now, I wouldn't suggest this given the interest rate situation in Europe at the moment, because it's going to affect your profitability. And from running numbers in the past of possibly, financing a storage unit purchase, it didn't work out. The numbers didn't come out favorably for me, basically. There's also very little to no maintenance and running costs of having a storage unit. You'll pay basically what's called comunidad, which is like communal charges in Spain, which will be probably no more than 10 euros a month at the very top end. And then your property tax bill will probably be very, very small as well. Again, I wouldn't expect it to be more than like 30, 40 euros at the max. But don't quote me on that, and do check with whoever's selling you the storage unit when you come to run the numbers. And as a result of that, you have the potential for a good ROI because of the low initial investment, because of the low running and maintenance costs, but also because of the high demand, which is pushing rent for storage units up a little bit as well. It is possible to get a good return on investment. Now we'll look at that in the next part of the video, so keep that in mind. And also from a legal perspective, it's much more straightforward as well having a storage unit than a residential property. It's relatively straightforward setting up a contract. If someone doesn't pay, then it's governed by the general LAU, which is the Ley de Arrendamientos Urbanos, and there's no like rent controls or anything like that like you find in the new Ley Vivienda, which is the property law in Spain. That makes it complicated. It's really straightforward from a legal perspective. Now, some of the drawbacks of investing in self-storage is that, granted, it can be a high ROI, but the potential for cash flow, unless you're buying multiple units or an entire facility, is not very high. Unless you're really going all in, you're not going to make life-changing money from renting out self-storage units. You're going to make a little bit of extra pocket money that might help, that you can then save and invest towards something else, but it's not going to be life-changing money unless, as I say, you're really going all in, trying to get a full facility or multiple units. And sometimes potential renters, they'll come and look at your storage unit and they'll think it's too small, when in reality it's not. Like I think some potential tenants, like, they are a bit picky and they think they need more space than they really do need. And so that can also work against your favor if you only own one storage unit, because if they want something else and you don't have something that's big enough to accommodate them, or it's too big and they don't need it, then they're going to pass on you and they're going to move to someone else, and then you're kind of out of the game. Not to mention as well that there are like multiple big companies that are now dedicated solely to self-storage. They have entire facilities and they're able to come in with aggressive offers to get new clients. So it's becoming very competitive, and you're at a disadvantage if you only have one or two units like scattered around, basically. All right, now looking at parking spaces, let's look at some of the pros. So if you think about general like high density urban areas where there's a lot of people, a lot of traffic, then there's almost going to be constant demand for parking spaces, because there's always going to be someone who's got a car who's going to be in the area and is going to want to park their car there. And as I mentioned in the previous section, especially where there's like restrictions like ultra low emission zones, what kind of environmental emission stickers the car has. Also, if there's limited parking in the street as well, then this can also create demand for private parking. And beyond all of that as well, like, most people want to be able to park their car knowing that it's in a safe and secure space. It's not going to be broken into, it's not going to get scratched by someone in the street. And by you being able to offer them a parking space like that, you're helping them solve a problem. And for the majority of people, I'd say it's more desirable to park in like a private parking garage or complex than it is to just park in the street in the open and hope for the best. And unlike storage units, I think this is much easier to maybe access and get into with little to no knowledge, because anyone could have a parking space. Like, you could even have it for yourself and then one day you don't need it anymore. You can still keep the parking space and then rent it on to someone else, and it's just kind of there on the side. It's generating you passive income. From my perspective, I think, of course, there's always some kind of strategical thought and intent behind investments, but I think It's less applicable with parking spaces because parking is like so high in demand. It kind of like sells itself in that sense. Whereas with a storage unit, you do need to understand a little bit about what a potential renter is looking for in, you know, a particular storage unit, like the height, like the shape of it, the materials used and all of that stuff. With a parking space, you know, someone's simply looking for, you know, a secure location, has enough space to park their car. And beyond that, there's probably not too much more to it, if I'm being honest. Like storage units as well, it's also very low maintenance and cost in terms of that. I would estimate probably about the same costs as for a storage unit, you know, no more than 10 euros per month of communal charges in whatever facility you're in. Probably similar again to what a storage unit is, but always check, you know, when you're purchasing a parking space, how much it is. Now, the next point can work as a pro and as a con, because I think with the parking space, the key is the location. Location. Because as I say, if you have a parking space in a very densely populated area where there's a lot of cars that pass through, a lot of people live, then it's almost certain that you'll be able to find someone. But if your parking space is in an area where there's not many people, you know, there's maybe parking in the street that's available, then there's not going to be the same demand because some people might just be willing to leave their car parked in the street for free if there's not many people in that area and the parking space is, you know, it's in the same area. So I think the location is really key, making sure that you pick the right location if you're thinking of buying a parking space, or if you have one already, understanding if it is in a good location where you will be able to rent it out. And now moving on to the cons. Now, whilst they are still affordable parking spaces, I would say that from my observations, a parking space typically does cost more than a storage unit to buy. And again, we'll look at that in the next section of the video when we're looking at kind of ROI. So there is possibly a little bit more capital required. Again, granted, you could probably take out a loan to finance it, but remember that it's going to impact your return on investment if you've got, you know, high interest payments. Because both of these kind of investments, they're not necessarily things that you can take out a mortgage on. A mortgage typically needs to be, I think it's around 50,000 euro minimum, something like that, maybe a bit lower in Spain. And you know what we're talking about here, we're talking about, you know, 10 to 20,000 max in terms of what you're buying. So it's going to probably be covered by a consumer loan, and then the interest rates on that are much higher. So unless you have some other creative solution to finance it, then you probably end up paying a lot in interest, basically. With parking spaces as well, you've also got the possibility of, and this can affect you whether you're the owner or someone who's renting the parking space as well, you know, someone parking in your space. That's obviously going to be annoying. And yes, you can get the president of the community of neighbors involved. You can get the police involved. They can impose fines. They can ask the person whose vehicle it is to remove the car. But ultimately, if they don't move it, then you're going to be looking at going down the legal process. And you know, whilst in theory, it probably won't get there, it could still go there. And then that's going to be a frustrating, long process for you and for whoever you're renting it out to as well. And it could put your rental contract at risk as well if the renter decides, well, if I can't park my car here, why am I going to continue paying for this space? So, you know, this is risk like with every investment. All right, so the ROI analysis is what you've all been waiting for. Let's take a look at storage units first. So sources on the internet, namely here I'm looking at El Economista, put the average return on investment for a storage unit as minimum 5% ROI. I've seen sources that have put it at 7 or 8% as well. So that's a pretty good return on investment for a storage unit. Whilst for parking spaces, 5% is typically the top end. And then looking at the average, according to the OCU, you can get between 3 to 5% on average on a parking space. And so to verify this, we're going to take a quick look in Idealista, see what we can find. And I've put it in an Excel sheet and I'll show you how we get to that. So let's head over to Excel. All right, so I've got many tabs open here to give you some examples. So right now I'm looking in the Chamartín district of Madrid in the Bernabeu Hispanoamérica neighborhood at what parking spaces are available for what rental price. And then I've done the same search, but looking at how much it is to purchase them. So I'm looking down the list here and we can see, you know, motorbike spaces, not too expensive. We're looking at 50 euros. We got a space for a large car is like 200 euros, which is really quite a lot. For the average car, we're seeing here like 150 for a motorbike, 30 for a motorbike, 100 for a small car, 100 for a small car, 110 for a large car, 95 space for a car and a motorbike, 90 euros space for a small car, 75, 80, 200 for a large car, you see. So if I just skip through these really quickly, these just pulling out some of the key ones for the small cars. So we got 115, that's a 20 meter square space. 100 euro for a small car, 100 euro for a small car, 110 for a large car. 95 for a car and a motorbike, 80 for a small car. So I'm going to say that the average rental income that you could expect from a small parking space is about 100 euros. Now, if we look at some of the purchase prices, then it starts to get interesting because you see a whole range of numbers like 30,000, like 27,000 for a large car, 14,000 for a motorbike, 16 for a small car, 27.5 for a large car, 15,000, I think this is a small car, 31,000 for a small car, 5,000 for a small car. So the prices range quite a lot. And this can again depend on the neighborhood, but kind of the most common price that is coming up here is about 15, 14. 14. If I skip through these tabs as well, I'm seeing like 14, I'm seeing 20,000. So, you know, because there's extreme values here, it is kind of impacted. So what we're going to say is we are going to say that the average price is 20,000. We're going to say monthly maintenance a month is about 10 euros. And then our estimated ROI as a result is 5.4%. Now, if I were to play with this, make it 15,000, then I could expect 7.2 maybe, but then maybe I'm getting less rent as well. Maybe I drop it down to 85 and that gives me a 6% return on investment. As you'll see, like as I go through the storage units as well and the parking spaces, you'll see like it really depends on what it is you're looking at. One thing I want to show you as well is look at the numbers up here. So in Madrid, you can see there's 6,000 parking spaces for rent, 400 parking spaces in San Martin and 60 in the Bernabeu district. That's to rent. And then if I look at the list for buying, again, the numbers are quite similar. So I've got 6,000 to purchase, 400 in San Martin, 48 in Bernabeu Hispanoamérica. Now I'm going to go to storage units in all of Madrid. Now to buy storage units in all of Madrid, there's only 200 storage units for sale, at least on Idealista. Of course, there might be others off this webpage, on other web pages, whatever. And to rent as well, you can see there's much more to rent than there is to purchase. And then going to like Chamartín and Bernabeu Hispanoamérica, there was only like 4 or 5. So I'm going to have to look at Madrid as a whole here. And again, the prices can really vary by neighborhood. So what I've done is I've taken my best estimate of the prices based on my experience, my knowledge from investing. So I'm saying the average purchase price for a 3-meter squared space, roughly about 12,000 euros. Monthly rent on average could be about 80, maybe even more. You can make it 85. And then we'll say the monthly expenses are about the same, about 10 euros. So that ROI works out at about 7.5%. So looking at this, in theory, storage units do beat parking spaces in terms of ROI. The catch, of course, is that there are less storage units available. There's more knowledge probably required. You need to know exactly what you're doing if you want to get that profitability. Whereas with a parking space, the profitability is maybe not as high, but it's much, much easier to find a parking space that you might want to purchase and that you can rent out. So I think the lower ROI is perhaps compensated by a more active market with more potential renters for a parking space. Whereas with a storage unit, my experience has been, you know, you can have a few months vacant at a time before someone else comes in and then they end and then another few months vacant. Whereas I think with a parking space, you could probably get someone fairly regularly to rent out that parking space. So that's my conclusion, guys. I obviously invest in storage units and I haven't invested in parking spaces yet, but this was really good to do this video to actually talk a little bit about the two, to understand the differences, and it has opened me up more to the idea of parking spaces. Whether I'll go ahead and do it again is something else, but you know, there are returns to be had on both kinds of investment and both are interesting alternatives to residential property in Spain. Leave a comment and let me know which one you would choose between the two if you were to decide between them. And if you're interested in finding out more about my investments in self-storage, then be sure to check out this video where you can find out more. And if you're interested in the property market in Spain, residential property, then be sure to check out this video where I talk about the market in 2024. Till next time, I'll see you on the next one, and let's get this money.